Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into the Radults podcast, the podcast that highlights the stories of people who said fuck that to the idea that growing up means giving up on your dreams, and instead turn those dreams into their reality. Today's guest is Graham Nixon of Resist Records. Resist is a retail store, record label, touring company, management firm and booking agency specialising in hardcore and punk rock music based in Sydney, Australia. Resist Records has been the label behind many of Mike and I's favourite releases as individuals, and it's an absolute thrill to get a chance to talk to the driving force behind such an influential label in the Australian music industry. Graham Nixon is an absolute Radult, and he's our guest today on Radults. Graham, thanks for joining us on the Radults podcast. For the benefit of those listeners who aren't Aussie hardcore kids like us, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Graham Nixon and I run and operate Resist Records out of Marrickville in Sydney.
Yeah, I mean, and you sound pretty, humble when saying that. I guess for anyone listening, I would say that it is a cultural icon, this record label, and a must, visit music store when in Sydney. Mm-hmm. Continuing on from that, I mean, congratulations on 20 years of Resist Records too. How does that feel to reach that sort of milestone?
It's nice. Not as though when the label started or when the store started that we wanted to stop after 20 years. Like, things keep going once you've reached a goal or once you've reached a time milestone. But it's not that it's surreal, but it's just, you just keep moving on with what you're doing, and you got to get up the next day and do it all again and work towards 25 or 30 or whatever it might be, that you just keep doing what you're doing. So yeah, it's not really a thing where you sit back. I guess once I stop things, and once you start looking back at certain things and you sort of think of what achievements have been, it's sort of, you're obviously proud of them, but you don't necessarily, the world doesn't stop because we've made 25 or 20 years, and you sort of appreciate the fact that you can still do what you're doing and keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and I mean, like you said, if you're sort of like stopping to have a look, then you're not necessarily moving forward. But did you ever think or did you have any goals that it would reach this sort of time, or did you have any sort of landmarks that you were maybe not so much surprised to hit, but more grateful that you were hitting?
Oh, not necessarily. Like a lot of it's really weird because I remember when Parkway first sold out the Annandale Hotel, that would have been on Killing with a Smile. Like the Annandale Hotel in Sydney, for me, that's where I saw a lot of my, before I was involved with any music, that was the go-to venue in Sydney. So the biggest shows would be at the Annandale Hotel. And that's, from memory, like Rise Against played there the first tour, and, I saw Sick of All Agnostic Front, all these, bands play there. So to me, it was like this big, I wouldn't say, it was a really good venue. It was 400 capacity. No local band ever sold it out. I remember, I want to say the band Anti-Skeptic sold it out, and it made the biggest, it was the biggest deal in the world when a local band sold it out, and they weren't even from Sydney, they were, I think, from Melbourne. But to sell out a venue of a 400 cap room, when we did it, I was like, holy shit, that's, what a success. But, now that they're doing the Horden and things like that and selling that out at 5,500, like you sort of, to me, it's the smaller one that, that sort of is harder, if that makes sense, because it's hard to get people to a show when not everyone wants to go to a show, or when a band's starting out, or when a band's 1 or 2 albums in or whatever. Like, a lot of people just aren't on board at that stage, and it might take, like for Parkway, they were lucky that was their first album, and come sort of album 3 or 4, they were well beyond what the first album was doing. But like for me, I enjoy more working on a band that can't sell out a show, trying to get it to sell out, more so than going into a show where it's going to sell out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, more of a challenge.
Yeah, it is challenging. Like, we're sort of working on some stuff now for Bare Bones and for Jacob and a few sort of smaller, I guess, bands compared to what a Parkway is. That for me, if I can get those to, selling out the rooms that they're playing and getting consistent numbers and whatever. And we also work with Polaris, who are going into a new album cycle that will, there's some big, I wouldn't say goals, but the rooms that they're doing on the next album tour is a lot bigger than what they've done in the past. So it's sort of like that, to me, is quite challenging, and it's always, really good to see when it pulls off, but sometimes it doesn't always work out. But you got to have a crack at these things.
Well, I think you're having a crack is usually fairly successful, judging by the stories you're telling. Now, I'm really interested, is the reason why you feel motivated or more motivated working in those situations because it reminds you of when you first started out with Resist?
Possibly, but it's all it's hard to say. Like, I think every band's different in the sense of where they're at and what with what we do with Parkway to what we do with Polaris, what we do with Barebones, Jacob, Amends, or any of these bands that we're working with. Everything's a bit different, and you can't necessarily it's not. I feel as though a lot of people think or presume you can just run the same template over the same band and get the same result, and it's definitely not the case. So a lot of it, it's it's great to sell out a venue of 5,500, or to even sell out the Metro, which is 1,200, or to sell out what was say in the Art House in Melbourne, which was probably 250. But if it's I don't know what it is that makes that excites me to I think it's an attention that say if you're booking a 250 cap room, you want to get 250 people. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to get 250 people, but you don't want to go into a 250 cap room and get 45 payers, because you probably should have booked an 80 cap room to get 45 payers. So I always think the rooms that we put bands in is correct with where they're at. And that's a big, as far as the booking side of things, that's a big, it's a lesson to learn that you don't just have to, I think a lot of people think if you book a small band into a big room, all of a sudden people are going to turn up, and that's definitely not the case. People will turn up when you've got a fan base that turns up.
Does that mean that managing expectations of a band and of the crew surrounding them is a large part of your job sometimes?
I don't know if managing it. I'm realistic with where every band that we work with is at. If you can't, if you're getting 80 people to a show, or if you're getting 75 people or 50 people, it doesn't really matter how many people you're getting to a show. If you get 51 show, well, then the next show we should try to get 75. If you get 75 the next show we should try to get 100. If you get 100 that show, we should try to get 150. And that's how you build. And if you're not getting those numbers, you might have to play to, you go on a support tour where you might be able to be exposed to more people. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to come back to you, but if you can be playing in front of people, at some point it'll, come back to what you're doing, or what, presuming the band's good. So it's sort of, I think booking, as far as local bands and things go, booking the right rooms and making the rooms full and having a good night, putting a good bill together. There's a lot of things that go on that make a bill right that a lot of people, I think, get wrong.
Taking us back to the start, how did, the idea of Resist come about, and what motivated you to start the label out?
So the Scott from who sang in Toe to Toe, he started Resist as a retail store, and it was the skateboard and sort of music store specialising in hardcore and punk music. He, through the band, I guess he sort of had a lot of contacts, and knew that there wasn't much in the way of access to this sort of music, other than a couple of specialty stores. Missing Link was in Melbourne. We had Waterfront in Sydney and Phantom Records. Utopia sort of had a little bit of, the more popular punk and hardcore stuff. But as a whole, there wasn't, there's a lot of bands out there, and there wasn't many being available in Australia. And Scott sort of started the store to sort of make that more accessible, and was sort of the skateboard section of it was more to support local skating. Sort of, it wasn't the surf, dive, and ski type stuff. It was the local guy putting out skate decks and local sponsored skaters and things like that. So it was a very local sort of thing. And we used to do in-stores. I came on board a few years after, it was being up and running. But when he used to run a lot of in-stores through the store, and we used to do, we got to a point where we were sort of we had a lot of bands coming through, but not many bands had labels or opportunities to release labels. Like the labels at the time were, so Shock did, they were a distributor, but they had a lot of smaller labels under an umbrella type label system that they would have bigger bands like Body Jar and Toe to Toe and Mid-Youth Crisis or 1 Inch Punch, but a lot of those bands were a lot bigger than the smaller hardcore band that's drawing 30 people to an in-store. And we sort of just thought that it'd be cool to do a label that was taken serious, that was making local music available, that just sort of, because at the time too, we were selling a lot of bands demos through the store, so it wasn't as though they had a fan base, just that they didn't really have an avenue to put out music, because unless you were going to work with one of those bigger labels that were not going to be interested in selling 100 copies of something, we were like, let's just do something. Let's do a 7-inch. We ended up doing it with a band from Newcastle called Found My Direction. It sold out within probably, I want to say maybe a couple of months, 3 months maybe. And I didn't have any idea what I was doing. Scott had done it a lot with Toe to Toe. They self-released a lot of their early 7-inches. So it was more a thing of let's just put it out, see how it goes, and it went well. So we're like, okay, let's do the second release, and that's how it's pretty much been. We've sort of the label's up to closer to 180 at the moment, and that's pretty much how it goes. It just sort of you just obviously now we schedule things, and there's a lot of thought with what we put out, but that was how the first 20 releases purely were just you do one, there's do the next, and then you get one that sells really well.
I was just looking at your releases for a moment while you were speaking, and I was just going through my own personal journey through Resist. And for me, I was really into the Within Blood stuff, and I was super into. But the moment where I realized you're a big deal was Reflecting and Refracting, the Irrelevant record. And I was thinking as you were talking through the experience of getting the label side of things underway, how you mentioned that you were hoping to make it happen for bands that otherwise wouldn't get an opportunity. And I think Irrelevant are a really good example of that. They went on to be very influential.
Yeah, well, they were all Sydney guys. I knew some of them just by seeing them around at shows and whatever else. And then, not that I didn't, by that stage, I didn't know who any of them were. You just see people and you recognise, you've got 100 people at a show, you sort of soon realise who's regular and who's not. But they put out, I think, a 2-song demo, and it was really good. And by that stage, we'd already done a handful of things, and we did The Need for Divinity, which it was a cracking release by that stage, and we only did one pressing of it on CD, and then they did the Reflecting EP, which just sort of at the time, I guess, bands like Thrice and Poison the Well and a bunch of bands that sort of did a bit of melodic. Boy Sets Fire, that melodic vocal with a heavy vocal, and Damon could do it really well. He was a good singer, good frontman, and they just put together this EP that was, brilliant, basically. And and that's that, not that it really, it sold really well, and it's done what it's done. But at the time, I think too, the band had a lot of, they started playing with bands that were not the local band. They were getting on some bigger tours. They were getting on some bands, like some shows with the bigger bands that weren't necessarily the local hardcore band. They were they were going in the right direction, and they sort of, I guess they had a relatively good career.
Yeah, I think that marked a turning point for the label to an extent. Like, I could be wrong because obviously you are the label and you would know. But your releases from there just go from strength to strength to strength. So you get stuff like the Day of Contempt record that goes huge. Then you get Promies, which probably changes a lot.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a little band from Byron Bay, then Parkway Drive, pop up around Don't Close Your Eyes. And you play a part in changing the hardcore scene in Australia forever.
Possibly, yeah.
Which is pretty wild.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Parkway stuff, so those guys, when we went up to Byron, I think it was either Life, Love, Regret or Irrelevant. We went to Byron before, I guess, the internet was what the internet was. I used to have a pen pal in Byron we'd write back and forth just, basically what an email would be or what, people do now on Facebook and Instagram, whatever. But we were just writing back and forth about, this guy in Byron who just loved his local hardcore, like Australian hardcore music. And it was bands like Pitfall and Ceasefire and sort of a lot of Aussie bands that sort of, weren't ever going to Byron. And he was like, let's, send up a band one time to hear. And I was like, okay, well, it could be horrible, it could be good, could be whatever, who knows. So I want to say it was Life, Love, Regret. And they had one of the members who, his girlfriend at the time, had a brother in Byron Bay. So it's sort of like a thing where it was an easy show to do because there was some association there, I guess. So we sent them up. I went up. The show was sick. So the guy that I was riding with was Jed, who's Ben from Parkway's brother. They would come to Sydney just for trips and whatever else to see shows. Like, you get a group of 10 kids from Byron come down to Sydney for a show. And it was just a scene like no other. And the shows in Byron were amazing. There was never massive turnouts. Like, it wasn't as though, you might get 50 kids in the Yak, and it was just the craziest, wildest show ever. And there was no other scene in Australia like it. There was no other bands in Australia coming, like what was coming out of Byron was just really, unique to, I guess, what was happening at the time. Like, there was Prom Queen, and this was before Parkway was Parkway. So Winston and Ben were in Blueprint for a Nightmare, who they, like, say if you sent a band up that way, whether it be Irrelevant or whether it be, Stronger Than Hate or someone like that, whatever it was at the time, Blueprint was either playing or Shoot to Kill, which was Oscar's band, and Luke was in Think Straight. So all these guys, I guess I got to know them through these bands supporting, but Luke was doing our shows in Byron. Winston's parents were putting up the bands at their house. Ben's parents were putting up bands at his house. So between the two houses, you had a lot of, like, space to stay. So you didn't have to pay for accommodation. You didn't have to sort of whatever. And on top of that, you'd get, you'd wake up and they'd have your breakfast cooked. They'd, short of doing your washing and, making your bed and everything like that, they literally just looked after you as though, you were their own kids. So it was a really, it was just a place in Australia that was like no other. And they just loved what they were doing. Like, they were sort of just, they couldn't get enough of music. And then they ended up doing Parkway, and that's another story, I guess. But I guess the relationship with those guys was well before Parkway was even a band.
That's awesome. Now, I'm curious, does your skill set work across both the label and the store? Like, are there things that you can see that are connected to one another in the two jobs?
Well, somewhat. Like, I do everything, but I don't. The two, like, you sort of. I order everything. I don't necessarily process. So Courtney, who works in the store here, she does all our like stock processing as far as when the order comes. I do the order, it arrives, she processes and puts on the rack. But and what I guess people see online, but with the label, it's more a thing where we are distributed through Cooking Vinyl, who is distributed through Sony. So the Cooking Vinyl team, which is the guys who were from Shock originally, who I had worked with at Shock. So Shock used to distribute the label. So Stu Harvey and Lee Grappetta, they started Cooking Vinyl when Shock went belly up. And so they basically are my label team. So a lot of the marketing, or pretty much all the marketing, all the assistance that we get with the label is through Cooking Vinyl. So we, on the bigger titles, we have a lot of meetings where this is how we're going to roll it out. Is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? Should we do this? Should we do that? Should we spend money here? Should we do this here? And then on the smaller stuff, it's more a thing where it's like, some stuff you put out and you just hope that there's a response, but that's also from a band who is probably lucky for us to be putting this stuff out, if that doesn't sound too unrealistic.
Yeah.
Seems like a dick. But so there's certain things that you'll put a lot of, like say a Parkway or Polaris, where you'll put a lot of, the planning for that's probably close to 12 months. And then on a smaller thing, you just sort of go, okay, well, we're going to make sure they've got tour dates. We'll promote the hell out of the tour dates. We'll make sure, they've got records at shows, and you sort of can build it up that way more so than being like, we don't necessarily drop a lot of money into a band that full well is not going to sell a pressing of records. And a band too, like if you're getting, if your socials are somewhat lower and your crowd shows or your numbers are low, you can't, you'd be silly to be spending too much money on that purely to sort of hope that, again, getting back to the venue thing, if you play a big venue, doesn't mean people are going to come. If you spend a lot of money on marketing, doesn't mean it's going to sell. So it's a matter of picking what's worth risking and picking what's smart and doing what's safe without, and I think that's the difference between like a label that has no idea, that's just throwing money at something and then wondering why it's not selling. That's probably a good reason.
I think it makes a lot of sense like that. So go from that. So we're going to stop this from being all about business, and we're going to have a little bit of fun with this in this episode's Rad Break and change it up a bit. So I'm going to put you on the spot with this. Which 5 bands, current or disbanded, would you put on a bill, and what venue do you think that show could sell out?
Any band?
Yeah, any bands.
Oh dear.
You're evil.
5 bands. It's a tough one. I guess it's hard. I had to do a thing the other day where I had to say my 5 favourite shows, and it was sort of, over 25 plus years ago on a shows. It was very complicated to put together some. But I'd have to probably do a bill where I'd like to see Avail again. Avail were one of my favourite bands. When I toured them once, and I saw them. I went over to the States for some meetings, and they were lucky enough to catch me in New York, and it was probably one of the best shows I've ever been to. And just watching them play was really, I don't know, like I feel that sometimes bands play and it's a bit too, like I wouldn't say manufactured, but it's a bit, not very authentic. Whereas with Avail, every time you saw them, they were just on, they were they were really good, tight and whatever live, but they, like Tim as a frontman is just the most passionate person you'll ever meet, and they were just always good. So they would probably be on there somewhere. Then another band, I'd probably have Gorilla Biscuits in the mix as well. Gorilla Biscuits were a band, like when I was getting into hardcore music, they were definitely a favourite. And then you probably have Minor Threat on there as well, because without Minor Threat, you probably wouldn't have a lot of the music that I grew up listening to. Turning Point's another band that I would have on the bill. They were probably one of my favourites. Like anything that was straight edge, I was, still am straight edge, but the growing up, anything that was straight edge, I was all about. So that's sort of, it'd be somewhat a straight edge bill. But so that's, Minor Threat of Veil, Gorilla Biscuits. I'd probably, who else would I have on there?
You need a local opener.
Opener. Mine can be the local opener.
Yeah, fuck yeah. I'm coming to this show.
It's heavy to the bill. Oh, and Turning Points, that's the bill, yeah. Mine's there, Turning Point, Gorilla Biscuits, Minor Threat and Veil. And it'd probably be at, being in Sydney, I would have it at the Annandale, because the Annandale was such a good room in the sense that it was a rectangle. There was no pad sight lines. It always had a relatively good sound. It's no longer around, so you sort of, it is what it is. But yeah, so 400 people. Hopefully people would turn up to that show.
I think you get 4,000 people to that show. I'm pretty sure you'll definitely get your 400.
Yeah, I can see it rioting.
So can I. I'm definitely losing my voice. And all my life. Anyway, that's an amazing bill and one I would absolutely love to go to myself. And I mean, it's probably an impossibility, but that doesn't mean we can't all dream. We can probably put it together with YouTube footage.
Yeah, sure.
Let's not. I'd rather not.
Turning Point, the singer from Turning Point passed away, but they started doing some shows with Tim from Mouthpiece singing, and I was at a festival in Europe, and they were playing the day before I got to the festival, and I was sort of like, oh, do I change my plans to get there? How do I try to make this work to see them? And I just couldn't make it work to get there, and I was sort of like, really, at the time I was like, oh, I should have tried a bit harder to get there, and I'm sure the show might have been good or bad, but I would have loved to see the songs live, but it didn't happen.
Gutted.
Yeah.
That's
awful.
Yeah, and I think Alex from Gorilla Biscuits passed away last year as well. Yeah. So, I mean, it's making it a little bit harder to see this lineup. But I actually rewatched Salad Days the other day, and that just brought back a lot of memories that I didn't get to have in my own childhood, but sort of like shaped my taste in music.
Yeah, totally.
All right, so we're going to get back to the serious stuff. What would you say the biggest challenges have been working in the music industry, given how much change has happened over the last 20 years?
Hard to say. Like, I think I wouldn't say anything's easier now. Like, I guess the thing you're facing now is how accessible everything is, and how quick everything is. There's, like, when we first started the label, street press and magazines were the only avenue to advertise. So your advertising costs were quite high, based on the fact that for a band that was sort of doing a national campaign, you'd do an ad in, a Brisbane magazine, you'd do an ad in Sydney, you'd do an ad in Melbourne, you'd do an ad in Adelaide, so in Perth. So 5 cities, probably $400 an ad. That's $2,000. Then whether or not you did something in Kerrang or Blunt or whatever the magazine was around the time, that was probably, so you're sort of spending 1,000 sort of there. So you're sort of up to, like, for a national campaign, you're looking at about $4,000 or $5,000 without any major spend, which nowadays, like with digital advertising, yes, you can easily spend that and you can spend a lot more, but you don't necessarily need to spend much to get the word out there. And so that's one thing I think that's, from a money spending point of view, is a lot easier, better. But the accessibility is a bit, I think everyone's a bit impatient with how things are done. And I think too, like, from a fan's point of view, I think fans are a bit The whole thing of a band announces a tour and everyone telling them that they got it wrong or didn't go to this place, whatever is the bane of my existence. But that's just frustrating because it's sort of like, the other thing that's frustrating, and not that it's anything direct to your question, is when a band does a post of a show that was in, say, like on the recent Murder by Death tour we did, I think the Crow Bar venue in Sydney posted something about the show in Sydney, and someone commented, "Oh, how did this tour? Like, I didn't even realise this tour had already done Brisbane." And it's like, well, what part of the post did you not see from the other post leading into it that you've got to respond to a post that's already happened? Like that, just I don't understand that. So I've tried a discussion with a person that's that person, as in not the person that made that comment, but the person that gets on Facebook and Instagram after an event's happened to be like, "Oh, I didn't even know this was happening." It's I just that I don't understand that. So that side of things is frustrating. Has nothing to do with the music industry, or it does have it, but like it's sort of like it's totally unrelated to the label. But just that sort of, like I said, you announce a tour, everyone's got an opinion as to what room it should be in or the supports it should have been that you didn't choose. Recently, Architects announced that they're coming back to Australia. Polaris are doing the tour. Architects announced the tour probably 3 months before Polaris were announced. And there was a lot of backlash from Perth people because there was no Perth date on the tour. When Polaris announced that they were supporting Architects, a lot of people from Perth still complained to Polaris that there was no Perth tour. And it's like, they're a support band on the tour. It's not their tour. They can't choose where the tour goes. And there could be a reason why there's no Perth date. I don't know why. It might have been a financial decision. It might have been a venue availability decision. But I just don't understand that sort of, whining or complaining about a band not coming through that territory or that date or that city or whatever. I get that people want to see the bands, and I get that people can travel to a show. Whilst it's not realistic that every Architects fan in Perth flies to Adelaide or flies to East Coast or whatever, but it's not as though you can't go to that show. So yeah, I just don't, that side of the things where, years ago you would never write a letter to the promoter and you never had access to an email to write an email to complain, whereas now I'm sure it's across everyone from Live Nation to Destroyer Alliance to us to, sort of Chug to Frontier or whatever, that when a tour is announced, I would say 20% of the posts are people complaining that they got it wrong.
That sounds so frustrating. I actually now want to just punch someone in the head.
Yeah, and it's like when you work on a tour for I wouldn't say you work on a tour for a lot longer before, like say when the tour is announced, there's probably a good 3 months leading into booking the dates, holding the dates, confirming the dates, getting artwork done, doing a lot of work. Back and forth visas, like booking all the flights, domestic and international, and getting all the vans booked and all the accommodation booked. And then you get it, you're ready to go, you get your artwork, you're all set, your tickets are on sale, ready to go, and literally within the first 5 comments you get someone complaining, and it's like sick.
Nah. Anyway, I gotta move on from that before I just So I mean, taking into account social media and the internet and the whinging crybaby fans that just cry about everything, how have your tactics, if at all, changed when signing bands? Do you do anything different now as opposed to 20 years ago?
No, not really. Everything. I guess when you take a band on, you're realistic with what where they're at. So the way, like getting back to what I was saying before, like not every band's the same. So we've just started working with the Lazy Susans, who are sort of more indie punk sort of pop type band. They're not a heavy band by any stretch. They're whatever. So that's sort of the way we work with that compared to the way we would work with, you know, a Jacob or an Amends or something that are also new bands that we started with is totally different. And for us, it's a challenge because they're not, like for a band like Homesick, who we, you know, they're just a local hardcore band who we can just post that through our socials and hit the target about awareness and things like that, because people who are signed up to the Resist socials are from the world of either a Parkway type world or a hardcore world. They're not a Lazy Susans fan, so they possibly are now. But, you know, like, so that's the sort of thing that we've got to be, you know, that the way you approach that is totally different to the way you would approach, you know, like, say, if you were to do, you know, say the Born Free record, where it's sort of like you can put that out and the majority of people on our, I guess, your social network is going to hear it and know what a band like Madball or whatever sounds like, whereas a Lazy Susans fan has probably never heard a Madball song in their life. So it's sort of like a thing like that. So you got to, I think every band is different, and I'm sort of very aware of that. And I like the fact that, you know, we could be working on a Shackles record, but also working on a Lazy Susans record, and those are worlds apart as far as sonic sounds. But yeah, so like we don't really, don't necessarily approach anything different. We try to give 100% on everything we do, or give the record the best chance of succeeding, regardless of where or how big they are. I never necessarily go into a record thinking that it's not going to do well. And like the goals for some band, like I said, with a band, that if you're doing 100 people in a venue and you, like, if that sells out at 100 people, to me that's a success, as opposed to, I could also be working on a band that's doing 2,500 people per show and I treat it the same, but I know where they are at in their, like, how their popularity is, you know, like to get a band to sell out 100 people or to get a band to sell out 2,500 is the same expectation to me. So it's sort of, so each bands are totally different. You approach it totally differently, and you sort of work with where they're at and what their fan base is, as opposed to just another band through a cycle of releases.
I think that's really interesting insight, and it's quite refreshing to hear, because I think a lot of people assume that the music industry is like a copy-paste kind of scenario, where you can take a template and apply it to every act and expect that you're going to get the exact same response, which obviously you're not. You've identified so many reasons there that make complete sense that would lead you to think that there's different ways of achieving and attaining success and different ways of assessing it as well. Like, it's just awesome.
Yeah, I don't think, like, I think with the majors and like getting, like, not that I'm not going to hate on majors, but I think the major system 10, 15, 20 years ago was that you could take a person and run them through a template of sorts and have success. And you could possibly do it, like, there's a lot of ways, I guess, to see it. You could do it and you might get a success rate of 70% and be like, okay, well, the system works. Or you could just sort of be realistic and be like, well, this band, you know, if you've got a band that's never really done much in the way of touring and never put out much songs or whatever, and I think too, a lot of bands, just because you're in a band and just because you're playing shows or just because you're, you might, like, a lot of bands are impatient in the sense that it might take 5 years to build a fan base. It might take longer, it might take less, it might take whatever, but there are no two bands. Like, what happens with, say, 5 Seconds of Summer, you can't be like, well, why isn't my band doing that? You know, and, you know, like, good luck to 5 Seconds of Summer, but they, you know, like, they were a somewhat Sydney pop punk band that turned into a worldwide, you know, One Direction type band, and you can't, like, you can't run the same template over that. You might get, I think if you do all the things right you will see more success than just slapping things together and hoping for the best. Like if you're sort of not very organised and not very planned and you don't put a plan in place, then you will see terrible results. But if you put a plan in place and you have somewhat targets and you sort of, just some basic stuff like announcing things at the right like time they should be announced, or announcing like a lot of local bands, and I'm not going to rag on local bands because they sometimes don't know any better, but sometimes they get some basic things really wrong, and I don't necessarily need them all to ring me up to ask for advice, but they do some things that are like, well, that's never going to work. Just because you post it on social media doesn't mean it's going to work. And that's, I'd like to think we don't get, like we do the little things, the 1%ers, you tick all those things off, and especially on a bigger release, it makes a big difference if you have to get those things right. You can't, just slap it together and hope that you get, Parkway charting at number one. There's a lot of work goes on to get Parkway charting at number one, and there was a lot of work go on to get Polaris. They got number 6, which their EP before that was 38 or 40 something. So to get those results, there's a lot of effort, a lot of thought, and a lot of planning, and you got to do that to get those results. So that just doesn't come by, by just sort of doing a Facebook post and hoping for the best.
Oh, damn, I've got to stop doing things that way then.
Yeah. All right, so what were the records that changed your life as a fan? And then also, what would you say the records are that changed your life as a business, as Resist?
As a fan, a couple, I guess. As a music, like when I was younger, I was into a lot of rap music and hip hop music. Public Enemy were probably my favourite, probably still are my favourite band.
Cool.
I'd say Fear of a Black Planet probably was one that, like, I guess prior to that, when I would have probably been 14, 15, and you don't necessarily, like I was probably listening to that music purely because my brother or my cousin was listening to it. But Public Enemy was such a band that their lyrics made a lot of sense, and were sort of, I don't know, like I just thought it was really good. As opposed to, like, say, at the time, bands like NWA and a few of the other heavier sort of things were talking about too many things that I was just like, yeah, that's great that someone's killing someone and someone's doing drugs and whatever. I wasn't never interested. Where Public Enemy was really like common, smart stuff and political sort of like, or socially aware stuff sort of thing. So I could relate to that a lot more. And that sort of somewhat led me to, my brother brought home a Nirvana Nevermind. I think we borrowed it off a friend at school, and there was a song on it. I can't remember what it was, but it was like a really fast song, and I was like, holy shit, this is like, I've never heard of this sort of music. And that was sort of something that was like, I'd like to hear more of that sort of thing. And at the same time, I guess Rage Against the Machine was in that similar boat where it was, early 90s. And those bands were not the norm of what you would hear on radio. And at the time, when there's no internet and you don't know about a local record store, or you don't know anything about, you're just a kid living in the suburbs. And the only music that you're exposed to is what was on Rage or what was on, like a heavy show on Triple M or a heavy show on Triple J. I never really used to listen to metal stuff. So there was a lot of, like, Costa Zulia had a show on Triple J that was what is now the Racket, but it was, I think it was 3 Hours of Power back then, maybe, I could be wrong. But they were like, that was metal stuff, and I never was a metal person. I never liked metal. I think it might have been just the heaviness of, like, I don't know, like it was just something that I never really cared for as a kid growing up. And then I went to a show one night. So I used to listen to a lot of local indie rock sort of bands, and me and my brother went to, I don't know why we went to a Baby Animal show at the State Theatre, and Nitocris supported them. And this is like 5 girls who were just sort of like, I guess it was more grunge than punk, but I went to see them play again. I think I was 16 or whatever, and Toto supported them, or Toto played on the bill. You wouldn't say they supported them because it was probably just a local lineup. But that was the first sort of exposure I had to any type of, music that wasn't necessarily what I was already listening to. And then I was just blown away with everything about it. Like from what Nitocris did to what Toto just blew me away. And live, it was something else. Like it was like in the early days of what they were doing, it was sort of like a small room, and it was just so intense from what the band were doing on stage to what the crowd was doing in the crowd. It was just so, I hate saying the word violent, but it was so, like, everyone was so safe to everyone, but it was so violent and so aggressive that it was just like, what the fuck is going on? And it was just not that it was appealing, because I've never been I'm going in the pit type thing, but it was just one of the, the energy of it was just amazing and very, I don't know if addictive is the right word, but I still, listen to that sort of music. So, but those were sort of, so probably Public Enemy, Rage Against the Machine, I guess Nitocris, Toto. They were all things. And then, later on, as I got more exposed, and bands like I said, with Gorilla Biscuits, Minor Threat, and all those sorts of bands, anything that was straight edge at the time, that was, I was never, I've never been drunk in my life. I've never drank. I've never, whatever. Done drugs and things, and it's sort of like a thing where I could relate a lot to what the straight edge bands were singing about, more so than a band that was like, yeah, let's go and get drunk and whatever, because I've just that's never been appealing to me. So those are the bands that sort of, I guess, shaped to what, or influenced me more so than any.
Awesome. Now this is actually, we'll back off that a little bit, because we had a question later on for you, which was, what do you feel are the landmark releases for Resist? So I think this is a perfect chance to ask that off the back of that.
Well, the first one, FMD 7-inch, was very important, based on the fact that had it done terribly, we probably wouldn't have done many more releases. So when we took that record on, we didn't have a schedule of releases. Like, say, nowadays we'll have, I've got releases coming up through to next year and plans for more beyond that sort of thing. So, the label planning now is a lot more thorough and, precise, I guess. Whereas when we did the FMD 7-inch, it was just, let's put it out, hope for the best. It got a good review. I got a great review in Maximum Rock and Roll, which to us was wow, American Magazine has reviewed our release and gave it a good review, and it sold really well. We did 500 7-inches, and the response it got was just, overwhelming, as far as, wanting to put out something and have people actually care. It was sort of everyone loved it, and still to this day, it's possibly, arguably one of the best 7-inches ever to come out of the country, and that's pretty. When you think of that, it's like, whoa, that's sick. And then, so that would be one. Another would probably be the Irrelevant stuff, because they were probably the first band that, I guess they could have, I'm sure they had options to, I wouldn't say leave, but they probably would have had options to go elsewhere, and they didn't. And they, were also the first ones that were probably touring busier than any other band. They were just sort of a lot of bands may never get in the state, and a lot of the bands that we worked with early on, going to Sydney, or if you're a Melbourne band going to Sydney, or Sydney band going to Melbourne, or going to Brisbane, that was not the norm. Whereas nowadays every band's like, oh, we're just going to tour, and it's like, well, okay, well, good luck. But like it's sort of like if you're a band in Sydney, going to Melbourne in a year or for in a 12-month period was a big deal. And nowadays it's not so big a deal because everyone's doing it. But back then it was sort of like a big deal, and they were the ones that were doing it more often. So it was sort of like, like it was a bit of a step up for us, I guess. After the Fall EP we did, that was our 24th release, and that was the first time we set up distribution through MGM. So that was a release that we sort of were like, we did 23 releases ourselves, selling like to stores direct and things like that. The After the Fall EP was the first release that we had an actual distribution and got sort of, serious with getting it into stores and outside of the stores that we were dealing with, which was, a handful of stores. And then I'm like a Parkway. Don't Close Your Eyes. Whilst that was great and sold and still sells and whatever, probably like a Killing with a Smile or Killing with a Smile come number 38 on the charts. And I remember at the time we distributed through Stomp, and I remember the guy from Stomp. When we put that out, there was no real chart expectation. There was no, you were just putting things out to hope people bought it, or to hope people liked it or whatever. And obviously with Parkway, they had a big expectation because the Don't Close Your Eyes EP, they were a popular band when Killing with a Smile came out. And the fact that they went and recorded with Adam from Killswitch Engage was sort of an unknown for Australian bands too. Not many Aussie bands went overseas to record. So there was a lot of focus and, I guess, hype on that release. But I remember when it came out, it came 38, and the distributor called me and was like, "Oh, top 40 record, how awesome is that?" And I was just like, okay. I've never been, it's never, like I said, with the chart stuff, if you've never had a chart, you don't know that. You just put, you put things out and you're like, yeah, cool, 38, awesome. I don't really care because that's our first chart. It wasn't, it was just a really weird thing. Whereas now with charting and you're mindful of it, you sort of know how hard it is to get a result. So, but I guess the Killing a Smile got us our first ARIA sort of chart. And then after that, whether or not you look at another Parkway title, I feel as though you can add all the Parkway stuff together because without them, there's probably no label in the sense that their success helps us do what we continually do. Any of the Mindsnare releases, Mindsnare, I was a Mindsnare fan before we were working with them, and even when we did the Within Blood thing, I remember when Matt sort of was like, "Oh, we've got this other band." At that time, I can't remember where Mindsnare were at with the releases, but they weren't, they were probably still on Nigel's label Trial and Error. They might have gone to a bigger label with Hang Choke, maybe. I could be wrong, but they for me, Mindsnare were like a big deal. And to work with Within Blood, we were just working with Matt, was like, how rad's this? Matt from Mindsnare's putting out a record with us, and then to be able to then put out their other stuff was amazing. So those are probably it's hard to narrow 170 plus releases down to 5, but that's sort of the ones that stand out. If you ask me another question, if you ask me that same question next week, I would probably give you 5 different results. So maybe yeah.
That's awesome, though. And that just tells a really nice story, too. And I actually kind of want to come off the back of that question and ask you, I've asked you for your landmark releases and the ones that have changed the label. What are 3 lesser-known releases that you kind of hope people would check out now?
Oh, I've honestly been waiting for someone to ask a question like this forever. A Deaf in the Family, any of their releases, possibly the most underrated band I've ever worked with. They did the first record through Poison City on CD. We did it on vinyl for the first time. then they did the Small Town Stories album, which I thought was brilliant, and not many people did. And then
I love it.
yeah, then we did the Origins EP, which was sort of like a handful of new songs mixed with some B-sides and demos and covers and whatever. And they were just a band. I loved them. I loved everything about them. I really liked. I had worked with Andrew. Andrew was in Voice of Dissent, which we had worked with previously. He does the Poison City label. So I've worked with him for probably close to 20 years. All the guys in the band I had known, like I guess with the original band with Sarah in it, I hadn't known her, but I'd known Adam from just him being at the Art House, Matt as well as being with the Art House. And Matt's probably one of the best drummers I've ever sort of seen. Like he's just, and I guess I've seen a lot of really good drummers, but he's just one of those guys who I could watch drum all day because he's so good and just doesn't miss a beat. But as a band, that's probably the band that I'm like, how did this not get bigger than what they ever got? And that's not to say that they didn't. Like they toured overseas. They, did some good tours here. They sort of played shows. They, if they did an arty show, they'd probably sell it out. But they were just a band that never really got outside of the world that they were in. So that would be one as a collective. Then another Carpathian was a funny one because after Nothing to Lose and then they went to Isolation, there was a lot of backlash from the Nothing to Lose fans because they wanted the same record over and over again, yet Isolation happened and no one gave a shit, and then the band broke up and everyone gave a shit. It's sort of like a funny thing to be like, oh, hang on, no one supported Isolation, but yet the band broke up and now everyone wants to buy it. Like it was really, really weird, but
I lived that.
Yeah.
I lived that experience. I'm from Frankston, man, and I saw that happen. And I was just like, what the fuck are you people doing?
I think I got to see one of their last all-ages shows. So I'm from like the southeast suburbs here, and they did a all-ages show in Cranbourne Public Hall, and it went off.
Yeah.
But Isolation is still to this day my favourite hardcore album coming out of Australia.
Yeah, and it is for a lot of people. And like I said, like when it first came out, the response was very lukewarm in the sense that they were already I wouldn't say they were a very popular band before it came out, but they were a popular band in what they were doing, and they were on that cusp of like they could probably tour and do a corner hotel and get close to selling it out. Like they'll be on the Art House, like if you're going to sort of put bands into categories of where they're at, but they would be on that Art House level show. And Isolation came out and it was very, a lot of people were upset by it. A lot of people loved it. A lot of people that didn't like Nothing to Lose loved Isolation as opposed to the other way around. But as a whole, there was a lot of people that didn't really support it. And then when the band broke up, everyone now is all about Isolation. So it was a bit odd, but that's how it went. And then I guess for a third, to look back at what we've sort of done, there's been I don't think there's been too much. Like the Mindsnare stuff always, it doesn't sell as well as what you probably think it does, but it does at the same time. It does really well, but not in the sense of like a huge band as the legacy that they are, and the support that they have. Like they just haven't lost a fan in their whole careers. Whereas a lot of bands will, you can put out something and people will be on board, and then people won't be on board the next one. But they're a sort of band that, you never hear one person talk bad about the band, but they've never really, it's never as though they've been massive, but they've been very successful. But yeah, that's probably, there'd be a lot of things that I sort of feel as though should have done better should have been better received than what they were. But that sort of, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a brilliant answer to the question. And I really like the fact that you touched on very different bands. And for me, I totally agree with you on the A Death in the Family thing. I don't understand why that band never took off to the level that they deserve to and should have.
Yeah.
And I do think it's sort of...
like say with, I guess, not saying Smith Street Band's not a good band or whatever, but like say how popular Smith Street is.
Yeah.
When you compare the two bands, I'm sort of like, whoa, Death in the Family's a lot better. And when you listen to, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not dissing Smith Street, but
no, that's cool. Yeah.
Sort of like you see, maybe they were just before their time, like maybe there was just things that whatever, but I could still listen to, all those 3 releases that they did and even their demo and just sort of like be blown away with how good like the songs are written and how there's like just everything about it. And Blue Line Medic was another band that was, not that we worked with them, but they're another band that sort of just never really got to, beyond that art house level of band. And for whatever reason, who knows, but they were also an amazing band. But yeah, just happens, I guess.
It does just happen. And it was funny that you mentioned them just now, because I went to one of the last Reverence Hotel shows and Blue Line Medic played, and to see their draw now is fascinating.
Yes.
And I reckon it'd be the same thing with The Death in the Family, because that scene has evolved around that Poison City label.
Yeah.
And being that they're like the originator, I feel like they now pack a room that they previously wouldn't have, and it's just
for sure, yeah,
out of step, I guess.
I'm sure if they wanted to, like say if you did a Death in the Family Blue Line Medic show at the Corner Hotel, I've no doubt it would sell out really quick. But when they were bands at their peaks of their careers, they would do an art house and it would sell out on the night type vibe, and that at the time was also a big deal. So it just might be a different generation, different time.
Exactly, and I'm hoping you can do some cool stuff with Lazy Susans in that world too, because I really like the release. It's awesome. They actually played at my work a couple of weeks ago, and they were wonderful.
The album's really cool. Hopefully people are into it. Like they're lovely kids, and they sort of they deserve to be a really popular band. But they that was sort of a funny release for us in the sense that they had a lot of labels chasing them, a lot of interest, and they chose us. And it's always nice to be chosen, I guess.
Definitely.
If you could do one thing differently with Resist Records or the store, what would it be?
The label, I probably would have had distribution earlier on. But in saying that, we didn't really have the options to. Like, it's not as though we didn't, at the time, there was, Shock doing what Shock was doing, MGM, all the majors were doing the major thing. But we didn't really have an option. Like, I guess too, when you go to a distributor and being like, hey, can you sell our hardcore records? They probably couldn't give a shit. So, so that was sort of, like it took us a long time to get a distributor up and running. But I think had we had it from the get-go, it probably would have, I don't think it would have had any difference on the label and what the label's done, but I think it would have probably got us a bit more serious earlier on. Like, I feel as though we sort of, not that it was a hobby, but we sort of we're just putting out things for the sake of, not so much putting out things, but we're just putting things out just because we wanted to, more so than thinking too much about it. But in saying that, I haven't really changed. Like, if I like something, I'll put it out, as opposed to like, oh, is this going to sell 500, 100, 5,000? Who knows? But, well, let's put it out and let's see. But so that's sort of something I would have done. With the shop, there's not much. The shop, you're at the mercy of what, like, the shop's success is based on what releases are available and what you can stock and carry. And the shop's grown really, like, you know, the shop is like from back in the late 90s when the shop was going to what the shop is now, the stock, we've got so much more stock and things like that. And like I said, with the shop, you can only carry what you supplied. So you're only as good as the, you know, like the stock you're carrying, and if people aren't buying it. But I think with the shop and any small business, people need to support it. I know people, and it's the same with the bands, like people complain when a band breaks up, but there's probably a reason why the band broke up. And I know when stores close or when venues close or whatever, there's an outcry of support because the venue's closing, but it's sort of sometimes people just need to support things rather than, you know, like sort of whether or not they import or buy overseas or buy, you know, like, or, you know, download something as opposed to paying money for something. Like people will go and pay $4 for a copy but won't pay $8 for a download. Things like that are a bit out of whack for me. So that's sort of something that I think people need to support, both bands, venues. None of this stuff can exist without the support of the fan. And that's what I think's important. Like if you want the venue to continue to put on shows, go and support the venue. Don't go to the pub up the road that might have a cheaper beer because you want to save 50 cents. Go and support the venue that's putting on the shows. You know, if they've got a bistro, buy a meal. If they've got, you know, something else, buy it, support it. If they've got a shirt, buy it. If you want to, you know, if you want to support the band, go and buy their music or go and, you know, stream it or do whatever. Like, support these things. Don't sort of just sit back and think everyone else is going to do it, because I've seen firsthand with the shop where people don't support it. They get online, they talk about how they want to buy records, but they don't actually come in and buy records. And that's what you need to exist, basically. Like, we're doing fine, but it's sort of, you know, anyone's support is a bonus.
Awesome. These have been amazing responses, and we're really thankful for having you on the podcast. You're definitely one of a kind in the Australian music industry, and it's lovely getting a chance to pick your brain for an hour or so. But the whole purpose of this podcast is to show people what is possible if they decide to put their minds to it and back themselves despite others telling them that it might not be the greatest idea. And you were able to do exactly that with Resist. So to us, that makes you a Radult, and makes you definitely qualified to answer the question, what should other people do if they want to be a Radult? So what would your tips be?
Trust your gut. If you're passionate about something, do it. Make a way to do it. If you can't do it, you know, research what you have to do. Don't just presume it's going to happen. I think a lot of people just think that you wake up one day wanting to start a label, but they don't really know what's involved or what has been there before them. So they sort of need to, you know, get a few ducks in a row before they start saying that they want to do a label. But I think if you're passionate about something and if you know, want to do something, just do it. If someone's telling you not to do it, find out a way to do it. If obviously things, you know, like you might hit a wall at some point, but you either got to see how to get around it, or you've got to sort of work out a way to make it work if you still want to. Like, I don't think you should, you know, not so much that I'm not going to go down a road of, you know, or dreams and do what you want to dream or whatever, because sometimes that's unrealistic. But I think if you want to do something, just do it, as opposed to talking about it. But like, just, yeah, get out there and do it, get involved. And, yeah, definitely network with like-minded people, and with bands. Like, if you're sort of in a band, go and support other bands. And the more people you know, the more easier things become. If you don't know people, introduce yourself to people. Don't ever be sort of, you know, too shy to say hello to someone or to sort of go and introduce yourself to someone. I don't think it's a dumb thing to do. And I think, like, yeah, if your network can build, and if you're, you know, like the more person, like if you've got a lot of contacts and if you've got a ways to do things, you sort of will find that you get more results. So that comes from experience.
Those are all amazing tips for being a Radult. Excellent work, Graham. You've passed the Radult test. Now, I believe Mike is going to give you a chance to plug some stuff. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, so pretty much plug where people can find Resist Records, both as the brick and mortar store and also online, and then lead that up with some bands that you feel people should suss out.
Yeah, so the store is at 38 Chapel Street in Marrickville, and we're open 7 days, so anyone can come in any day of the week to see what we do. And then anything else can be found through the Resist Records website, which is just resistrecords.com. As far as bands, we have some upcoming releases from the Lazy Susans. We'll soon announce a Bare Bones album. They just put out a new single. We've got a lot of records that are on the horizon, and a lot of exciting new releases as well. As far as other bands that are outside of the Resist stuff, I really liked the band from the Gold Coast, Eliza and the Delusionals. I really can't get enough of her. Yeah, can't get enough of her new stuff at the moment, and her old stuff was really cool. Press Club, I really listen to a lot of their stuff lately. I like a lot of girl vocals, so I'm really anything with a girl vocal I'm all about. So there's some of their stuff. New Lazy Susans album out in a couple of weeks. New Men's record out soon. So a lot of new things. There's always new music, so people get out and sort of check it all out.
Awesome. Well, thanks for your time today, Graham. It's been awesome having you on the Radults podcast.
Yes,
I shall drop in and say hi next time I'm in Sydney. I kind of always have every time I come in. We just don't know each other, so you wouldn't know.
Hopefully I've been nice to you.
You have always been nice to me. I got one of my all-time favourite shirts from one of your clearance bins.
There you go. Bargain.
Not to mention a bunch of good records. And also just thanks for bringing Murder by Death out. I fucking love that show last weekend. So cheers for doing that.
Good band. They were awesome. I only saw the Sydney show, but they were awesome. So it was good to sort of. I was a bit annoyed when they had a tour cancel a lot of years back, and I sort of was bummed because I've always wanted to tour them. And then when someone else was doing it, I thought, oh, that saves me from doing it. And that fell over, and then we ended up, discussion again as to how we could make it work. And we made it work. So it was good to see them.
Yeah, and fantastic choice of support band, Laura Jane Grace.
Yeah. So it was initially how it all came about was that we had a Murder by Death tour that was just 3 shows, and it was finishing, and I had dates for Laura booked that started a week later. That was what the tour ended up being. And then I sort of was like, oh, this is a bit weird that a lot of the supports would be on both shows. And I know the bands have, like Murder by Death's done a lot with Against Me, and I sort of planted the seed as like, hey, how about we just join these two together? And Laura didn't want to play over them because initially it was supposed to be Laura's band, then Murder by Death as a support. And Laura didn't want to play over them because she likes Murder by Death too much. And was sort of like, I'll just support them. And I was like, okay, let's do that. So it worked out great for everyone. It was awesome to sort of make it happen. So really fun.
Brilliant. So Mike and I both endorse the advice of Graham here. Get out, see some local shows. You're probably going to discover your next favorite band opening for whoever you went to see. It always seems to work that way.
Definitely.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, you're a certified Radult. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah. Have a good day.
Will do.
Yeah.
And that brings to an end another episode of the Radults podcast. We hope you've enjoyed your time with us today and that you've left the episode feeling even more inspired to turn your own creative dreams into reality. As always, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, follow, and share our content. and go out there and live life a little more radult. Have a rad day.